And subjects. Thank you. Thank you everybody for being here on a very cold Friday, although YouTube. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Also, thank you so much for being here today with us. Should we give our panelists I'm gonna run you through the schedule for today, real quick. So we're gonna do the intro, the welcomes, and then panel discussion will be from around. Not gonna be 5:05. Now it's gonna be around 5:10 to 5:55. I have 4 questions I prepared for the panelists, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Then we'll take a break and we'll feed you. And then we have after that, we'll have about 1 hour long. Now it's going to be maybe a little bit short, maybe 50-minute workshop with our panelists. All right. So we have here with us today Caroline Pryor. She's an alum of ours. Caroline Pryor is an advocate, organizer, and former 4th grade teacher. She serves as the lead organizer at M.Ed, fighting for teacher voice and all things education, as well as the co-chair of Fair Budget Coalition Education Issue Group and co-chair of the Defend DC Education Coalition. In her role, she works closely with Ed's cohort of teacher leader fellows as they craft and execute their policy agenda. She is passionate about how we can forge racial justice futures for both our students and our educators, and cherishes her work with the Rest and Rights Black Educators, which she designed and launched in the fall of 2024. Caroline comes from a family of teachers whose stories inform her work. In her free time, she enjoys hiking, cooking, and exploring DC's museum. And then here we have DaVaughn Montgomery. Correct me if I pronounce your name wrong, please. He is originally from Harlem, New York City, and has been an elementary educator in the district for the past 14 years. Currently, he serves as the Dean of Students and Culture at Harmony DC Public Charter School. He holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from Oberlin College and a master's degree in educational policy and leadership. Here we go. Advocacy, voice, relationship building, and agency are central tenets of his educational philosophy and have shaped the type of educator he's going to become. As a developing educational leader, he is interested in taking steps towards fostering a sense of community where all stakeholders have agency in the educational process. As a member of the Office of the Superintendent's Advisory Council, he has collaborated with educators, school leaders, and parents to provide feedback on future educational policies. As an Empower Ed Fellow, he has advocated with fellow DC educators about issues that are important to educational community members and local authorities. His commitment to uplifting voices inspires his continued quest to gain access to the room for the magic. And then next we have Dominique Moore, is a dynamic entrepreneur, educator, and community advocate dedicated to uplifting Black, brown, and underserved communities. As a founder and executive director of LifeBring and Mommy Gun Entertainment, he works tirelessly to provide youth services, women's empowerment initiatives, social justice reform, and financial literacy resources. With over 13 years as a public school special educator, she also serves as Empower Ed's democracy co-chair, advocating for equitable education and social change. Her philosophy is centered on educating the whole child, mind, and heart, believing that freeing a child's heart opens the door to learning. A lifelong learner, Dominique holds a bachelor's degree from Virginia State University, a master's from Capella University in educational leadership, and a coursework from Harvard University in philosophy. Through LifeBring, she leads impactful programs like the Book Bag and Scholarship Drive, Peace in the Streets, and Catch Your Thing for mental health awareness. Mommy Gun Entertainment serves as a resource hub for mothers seeking parenting, education, and community engagement. Dominique has been featured on WPGC 95.5's creator of the DMV, is a 2-time DC Teacher Voice Award winner, and has collaborated with key city agencies to drive change. Passionate and visionary, she remains committed to leveraging her expertise to advocate special education support and community initiatives. And last but not least, we have Scott Goldstein. He's the executive director and board chair of M.Ed. Scott.
Sorry.
Scott was a social studies and ESL teacher in DC public schools and public charter schools for the past 10 years. Scott has taught in private, charter, and public schools as well as international settings. In addition to teaching experience, Scott has been a teacher trainer, facilitator, and school leader. Scott has advised local leaders on education policy, consulted on education policy for local campaigns, and elected officials and written extensively on education and policy. Authoring 2 books on youth involvement in the political process. Scott founded M.Ed in 2016, inspired to help young people by keeping great teachers in the schools where that they lead them the most. So to begin the panel, I have a question that sort of will intend to draw out the stories from our panelists about, your stories being a teacher at the same time being a policy advocate. So my question is, so you're all current or former educators, teachers at schools, and teachers often have to advocate for students at school. But what was the key moment in your career where you decided to take your advocacy beyond school? Now you want to start with Caroline.
I think it's kind of ironic that I'm sorry. I believe I'm the only one on this panel that didn't start advocating while I was in the classroom. And my experience in the classroom definitely informed a lot of my perspectives on what needs to change in education. And in particular, I think, I came into education, I came into the classroom with this really pretty naive. And the first year that I taught test prep, which in my school for my 4th graders was 3 months of dedicated boot camp for test prep. And that was, I had seen some things that I was like, oh, institutionally, this is not working for our students. This isn't working for our schools. But that was the first time where I was really like, something is really, really wrong. We had a passage that we gave the students. It was a former test passage that had been used by the state test previously. And it was a passage about a sheepdog herding sheep. And it was from the perspective of the sheepdog. And he identified himself as a border collie, but my students had never seen or heard of a border collie. And they had no concept of what was going on. And so I'm, grading their responses, their passages, and had to grade it the way that the state would have graded it. So they were getting 0s and 1s. That's not right. This student, his Lexile level is way above what this passage is. And I have to give him a 1. And he's trying to write this and he's trying to fit it into his own worldview and his own context. And it was, he's like, oh, this is about a boy who wants to be an entrepreneur and is taking over the family business. I had a student that was trying so hard to fit it to his interests. He was writing about Harriet Tubman. And it was just really disheartening. And every single passage that we presented them with was pretty much the same way. And I was like, my students context for this. And I, had not yet learned the baseball study, but I knew about Scarborough's rope, and I was like, oh, my students have no context for this. So their reading comprehension is really low. No, they are much smarter than this. And I just felt like this is not something at the school level that this feels like it needs to go way over our head. And even at the school level, at my particular school, every time I tried to make a suggestion, or advocate for something, my instructional coach would listen. No one else would really listen. And so that was really disheartening. So I was like, okay, well, all of the advocacy I have to do has to happen at the institutional level then. That's where we have to go and fix things. And so that eventually brought me to this program. And that was another learning curve, right? Because through the coursework and also through working with M.Ed, I was like, oh, it's not enough to just work at the institutional level. And I learned it's not enough just to work at the school level. You have to have all of those things really aligned and linked together. And so working the macro and the meso and, the school level to make sure that we're really making change and advocating appropriately. That I think was, for me, sort of an insight. Go through that experience and having to bring my students through that experience.
Caroline, the panelist at risk of just jumping.
Okay. So for me, voice has always been like a thing. So I've always felt like misunderstood when I was young in school. So that, I guess that's a big thing for me, kind of giving kids, like listening to kids, right? And so for me, I've always taught elementary. So I've taught everything from pre-K to 5th grade. And so there was a time where I was at school that was kind of trying to bridge the gap by pushing academics way earlier than they need to be pushed. And in that space, I saw that the social development wasn't where it needed to be. And for me, I was in a space working with Black and brown children and having to kind of police them for existing in a space where they didn't have, the tools to kind of conform, right? And so for me, there was this battle of being put in a place where philosophically I don't kind of jive with what's going on, and then kind of having to be in that space and then getting in trouble when I would kind of go against the grain and say, well, rather than punishing this kid for misbehaving, I'm going to teach them the right behavior, right? And so for me, that was what we do as educators. But when I would do that, it would be received as, why are you letting this behavior slide, and that kind of thing. And so for me, that was a big conflict, and even the administration wasn't necessarily receptive to that. And so that kind of moved me into the leadership space. And so I'm currently a dean of students, and as a dean of students, culture and behavior and those kinds of things are kind of the central things of what I'm doing. And when I got into leadership, what I learned was that just by being there doesn't necessarily give you the keys to the city, right? And so I needed to kind of get some more training and support on how to do that well. So I did know that I can socialize with kids, I can kind of pump them up, but there's a lot more things attached to being in that space. So for me, once I got into that space, I was like, okay, now I have to deal with keeping families in a certain way, keeping teachers happy, keeping students. So like there were a lot more things to gamble with and kind of take into consideration with, okay, I thought that I can just get in there and kind of, if I'm the one disciplining the kids, then the stuff's gonna be different, right? But not necessarily, because again, there's politics involved in that. So for me, at that point, that's when I went to my master's program, and kind of in that program at American kind of opened me up to, okay, this is a little bit bigger than just being in that space, and how do we, from within that space, bring more voices to the table. But then it's deeper than that, right? Because also you need resources. You need, if you're a part of it, I'm in a charter school. So if you're part of an LEA, you have to figure out what is their philosophy on X, Y, and Z, and how do you live within that space and that structure. But then at the same point in time, if you're in a city or a larger area, how do you kind of do that? And then when I thought about that, I'm like, well, who makes those decisions? Who's at those tables? And so I think that working with Empower has helped me kind of be in that space to kind of actually talk to those policymakers, because again, at every level, what I've learned just in general is that the higher you go, the more hands are in the pot, and kind of figuring out how do you navigate different spaces. But I think to make the most effective change for me, needed to kind of go a little bit higher than just kind of being.
I just wanted to make sure you finished your thought. The question, what was a pivotal point in my career I decided to take advocacy to the next level? I come from a family of educators. My mother and my father are both actively still in the classroom. So I believe growing up, I've always heard the ins and outs of education, the things people complain about and things like that. to my background, I am a special education teacher. So when I came into education, I always knew that I wanted to be in the administrative role. I've always cared about culture and behavior, much to the philosophy. You can't educate a child's mind without educating the heart. I've always wanted to ascend already to the top, but um, policy or administration is not an undergraduate degree. So I picked the next best thing I like, which was special education. Well, when you think about it, it's still heavily federally mandated and law-based. So a pivotal point in my career where I said, okay, this is no longer working is when it stopped making sense to me. When it stopped making sense, I stopped breaking my back because I said, okay, we can no longer attack the system. We have to attack the structure. I was going through a teacher leader program where the actual task was to take a issue that we had with education and turn that issue into legislation and how we would fix it. And I found that I was really, really interested in it because, like I said, when I realized that it was time for changes, when it stopped making sense to attack the structure and not the system. So when I realized that our grading scale was not equitable, when I realized that we were continuously and habitually socially passing children who were not ready based off standards, and then you sit them in a classroom with me and you expect me to work magic in 10 months, and that is no longer fair. And you think you're gonna tie it to my money and stress me out, much to how I feel about educator wellness and burnout. We have to fix the structure, and if we can't attack and change the system, because there's no way that you tell me we should not have teacher burnout and you put resources in place for me not to be burned out, but you don't change the structure that's burning me out. I don't get it. So that's just kind of a pivotal moment in my career where I said, you know, I needed to do more and I needed to learn and figure out where to get a seat at the table so that I could do and change things. Another thing, one of the reasons I'm really big on community schools and wraparound resources is because you tell us that we are challenged and tasked with educating the entire child. There's no way I can do that during the entire school day. It's just not possible. It's not feasible. And then sometimes you have teachers who tend more to the character and the heart of the child than actually instruction and standards. Because if you're hungry, if you're sleepy, if you're tired, if everybody was arguing last night, nobody knows how to communicate in your house, and you come in with all of that. So I can't even access the 1, 2, 3s and the ABCs until I get that together. So if we can't change the system, then we have to change the structure. And that is really why I was just like, I have to do something.
Yeah. For me, and the story of moving into advocacy is really the story of founding and starting this organization while I was in the classroom. But there were so many points along my educational journey, my teaching career, that I just felt like there was a huge conflict between what everybody in the school knew to be good practice for students and families and for educators, and what was happening at a policy level. And I think that tension was just constant for me from the beginning. I taught first at a charter school, or two schools that I taught at for the longest stretch. One was a charter school that educates mostly immigrant, recent arrival students who are like 16 to 24-year-olds, a GED program. And then I taught in traditional public high school. And what I always talk about in terms of starting Empower Ed was just seeing enormously high turnover. It had happened throughout my teaching career, but when I ended up in teaching in DC public schools, we had 30, 40, 50% of the staff leaving several years in a row. I had 4 different principals the first year I was at the school. And I would just see the way that that was impacting the students and the assumption that you would not be back the next year. And I think the real inequity that they had so much instability in adult role models and mentors in their life, often outside of school, that we were doing additional damage to them by doing that in school in a place that they really should be able to expect stability of adults. And so that's what really gave me the impulse to think about doing something about teacher turnover and retention and starting Empower Ed. But when I started to go out and speak about it, what I noticed was how few educators were really in those spaces speaking about it, and how little it represented the teaching corps in DC, which was majority Black teaching corps at the time. And we went through a period where you may have studied the kind of, education history here a little bit, but where we had a new chancellor come in and a new system of mayoral control of schools. And we had the largest drop in Black educators of anywhere in the country over a 10-year period, the largest increase in white educators anywhere in the country. And I think, to me, it was the constant tension that we were being sold what I think is a lie, that you are choosing between putting the students first and prioritizing the well-being and needs of educators. And I think if you listen to some of the things that Dominique just mentioned about, I can't do this all by myself, and the community schools model, you see in that answer, teachers have ideas and solutions to make it work. And that when teachers are saying, we can't do all these things, it's not an excuse, it's advocacy for what the children they are serving need. And so I felt the need really to lift up both things, which is if we're going to keep teachers, we need to listen to the ideas they have about changing the school system to support the kids they're serving every day, and stop putting into conflict the needs of teachers and students, and assuming that teachers don't want what's best for their kids.
Thank you so much. As I'm listening to you, and as I was also reading our students' questions that they prepared for you, I think I'm seeing a lot of like echoing, like in terms of like frustration and like issues or like awards like hitting right when you are in the educational system. The second question, you alluded to it a little bit because you were talking about as you get into different a new role, you see new layers that's added to the same issue. So my second question goes, as you may know, our program at Transformation is a transdisciplinary program. So we have our learning and teaching for current teacher residencies in DC, and we have our policy and advocates who are also currently doing their internship or their full-time job in admin or nonprofit or policy advocacy roles. So we intend in our program to bridge the disciplinary boundary of learning and teaching and policy and advocacy. So based on your teaching and your advocating experiences, what are some misconceptions that policy advocates and teachers might hold about each other's work? And can you suggest one strategy for connecting policy advocates and teachers? Let's start with.
I think for me, one big question that I've experienced is that from the educator side, I think that advocacy seems like this huge mountain to climb, and that it seems like this unattainable kind of thing that takes time, takes energy, takes resources that I don't have, and that it's in reality, I feel like it's a lot simpler and there's a lot more access points than educators feel that you can do survey work, you can do like there's a lot of entry points into that space. So I think part of it is kind of demystifying what advocacy is and kind of clearing up the myth behind like you don't have like you can do it with limited time and resources. So I think that's one big thing. So maybe from the advocacy lane, being more communicative about different ways that somebody can engage with the campaign. So to give them multiple options and that kind of thing. So I think that would be really helpful.
I think this is one of the reasons that I love Empower Ed, and it's because it does exactly those things. It bridges the gap between the teaching and learning and advocacy. And to piggyback off of what you said, and you said it a little bit too, you said that policy and advocates often think that we don't have our children's best interests at heart. When I think very much to your point, but we also think that sometimes, was my bias, I think coming in, that policy advocates don't really know what to attack in the classroom or what to take from problem to policy and how to interchange those things. I think the biggest thing we could do, like you said, is to make great access points to legislation and policy and to the small changes and the ripples that we can make into the system. Also, while inviting policymakers and advocates into our world as well, so that there are opportunities and no tension and communicative ways to bridge that gap moving forward. I think that one of the best things with me with Empower Ed has been learning how to literally take those steps and attack the problem. That's why I like the organizing guide that we're going to look at later, because that's essentially what it is. We think that they don't have our best interests at heart. They think that we don't have their best interests at heart. And everybody just kind of needs to have a woosah, a hard reset, and come to the table together.
Well, I've been out of the classroom for 5 or 6 years now, I think. And one of the things I think that drives the misconceptions is being out of the classroom for a period of time, which is why I think like for us, the model is that we are just listening to teachers all the time about what it is, right? That our model is based on having a teacher fellowship program. We have, I don't know how many chats we have with various groups of educators that are popping up all day. And it's just hearing constantly what's happening, right, with teachers and what they're concerned about. Because I think the misconceptions from policymakers derive from the fact that some of them obviously were never in the classroom. And a lot of people, you know, they might have been in the classroom a little bit, but it was a long time ago. And I think the more space you get from it, the easier it is to see a problem as easy on paper that's actually quite complicated in reality. And I think there's a temptation to like come up with policy solutions. And I think I'll say something that seems like counterintuitive, that like there's a misconception that like the way to drive outcomes is just to have like a lot of urgency about them. And I think what happens is from a policy perspective, it's very easy to have urgency and be like, what we need you to do is hit this mark in this many years. And like, we're going to set goals. And by the virtue of setting goals and having a lot of urgency, we're going to meet them. And I think just the disconnect in time and space between actually going through the motions every day in a school and seeing everything that pops up, you know, creates that real conflict. And then just that the policy is complicated. I wanted to go back to what Caroline said in that first comment about the baseball study. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but there's a study about literacy, right? Which is that if you give a passage that they gave, it might have been fourth grade or something like that, same passage to two groups of students, and one group of students knew a whole lot about baseball but had a very low reading level, and the other group had a very high level reading level but knew almost nothing about baseball, right? And the group that did significantly better was the group that knew about baseball. It's contextual, right? Content is actually can be more important than the literacy skills themselves, and which is why standardized testing can be really biased, right? But that's the kind of nuance that I think from a policy perspective, you're like, just drill literacy, give them more time in reading class, and then they'll read better, right? And it's the experience of actually being in a classroom that changes that perspective.
I think, and I also want to like, just for context, the policy makers and the policy advocates that we're talking about in this context are all very local,
Yeah.
DC. We only operate in the local level. And they're old. And you know, like sometimes when we're talking to policymakers, I mean, this was like a big like aha moment for me was when we were talking to a council member who has never been in the classroom, and some of them have been. But someone was talking about co-teaching and like, it's so great because I get to go to the bathroom. And he was so mean. And so like, in some sense, there's like that sort of thing that we're overcoming with like the policymakers, and then with some of the agency officials, I think to the points that everyone else on this panel has made already, you hear a lot like, well, your scores are not good, so you must not care enough. And like, you must have, and this is something that like I experienced a lot at my school too, is like the best way to have an anti-racist future for our students and to like make sure that they have like a liberatory like life future is to make sure that they are girls in like all of these like testable, that they excel on paper in like standard American vernacular English. And it's something that we come up against, I think, pretty regularly is like, well, you can say all that and you can have all these like extra supports and wraparounds, but it's not driving test scores up. And so it's not working and not giving it enough time to work. And we're not really like actually resourcing these initiatives. And so it's hard, or like we're resourcing them and then pulling them back, which I think we're experiencing right now with like the kindergarten literacy policy that was just rolled out. And so I think that's really difficult for us to sort of like go up against. And I think it's really important to have teachers out in front that are combating that narrative. And then I guess like from my own perspective, I was actually surprised by the number of policymakers and agency officials that like had been in the classroom. That was actually like surprising to me. And that's something as well that like for our advocacy that we can use and pick up on, like, you remember this when you were in the classroom, this was something you experienced, and it's still something we're experiencing, even though, you know, you entered OSCE to fix it. But on the ground, it's not fixed yet. And so we need your help in
In your experience, does it often make a difference if the person you're speaking to, the policymaker, the person in the position of power has been in the classroom?
I mean, I don't know, would you all agree? I feel like it helps.
It helps, but I also think that I think it depends on like what system they're into, right? And so I think another kind of piggybacking off of what everyone else was saying was that like the implementation piece is right, is the gap for me. I think that oftentimes a plan might look crystal on paper, but actually getting people to get involved in that work is something that gets lost sometimes, or the way that an initiative might, be designed, there's some missing components to that. And I think that sometimes people kind of rush through things and don't think the implementation piece through. And that there's oftentimes a lot of structural components that need to exist before something can kind of have that full breadth. And those things often don't get discussed, like root causes that aren't always.
Yeah, I would say this might sound cynical too, but it kind of depends on your training and your career trajectory. Because the reality is we have institutions that train people for education policy that have a very firm view about things. And I think often if you go through that and you sit, that's what you hear for 2 or 3 years. Especially you might have been in the classroom for a little while and then you've gone right to a particular education organization or through a particular training. There's a center called the Broad Center, which is at Yale, which trains people for like superintendent level work. And they have,
Very briefly, it's through the Yale School of Management, which is their business. So
Yes,
that's
okay.
context.
and that's good context because what it is a business approach to education. And every single chancellor, superintendent, deputy mayor for education that we've had since mayoral control has gone through that exact same training institute, right? So, if that's what you hear, now a lot of those people were in the classroom for 5, 10, 15 years before they moved into senior leadership roles, but then they went to a particular training with a very particular bias, right, about how to manage school systems. So sometimes the classroom experience can be pretty distant. And there's like a passion from that and a relation to educators from that, but there's been a philosophy change, right, in some ways because of training. I would say just like pay attention to that. I think that matters a lot too.
I was like telling them the story of how I got into become interested in educational policy, because when I also feel like when I talk to teachers and when we talk about, okay, this is going to be effective, especially when it comes to critical pedagogy, and then especially when we push back against standardized testing narratives, and then the teachers often are so concerned about the policies that's hanging on top of their head, like, oh, but what if my students fail the test, blah blah blah. So that's what like got me into the space of educational policy. And then I often share with them, I think the very first policy class I've ever taken, because I had to like get myself out of teacher and then go to the other department, take education policy courses. And then my professor at the time was like, I am this and this. I am interested in the nationalization of educational policy. I don't care what teachers think about educational policy. Like, so that's just, get to like the philosophy part we're talking about.
And people at that level can be very just, it's like, oh, that's anecdotal, what a teacher thinks about it, right? And I think you can get deep enough into being a policy expert that you feel like experience is totally invalid, right? I mean, that just happens all the time. You hear, right? Like, it's just like, yeah, that may be your experience, but that's one person in one school. But when I look at the data, it says, everyone's failing here. So that must be because, right? And they just draw on whatever the point of view is that they were trained in to inform what that is rather than people's experience.
Thank you. I'm going to move us to the third question. So I would like to ask our panelists here to each share one strategy that has been effective in your work to attain high community participation when you're organizing. And let's start with Dominique.
One strategy that I think has been advocacy here. Of course, we are in the nation's capital. I think all the cards are on the table here, but DC has a very rich culture and tradition with community activism. Every time we turn around and pop up here, there is community activism. You can find a protest for any given day at any given time, almost any given place in this city. So for me, I want to say grassroots has been probably the highest turnout for me. I think there are a lot of strategies and data collection and perspectives that you gain in grassroots organizing and collecting data, information, and talking to people. It's almost like a what's it, top side up, the bottom side up approach. The people at the bottom often have some of the widest perspectives because they're able to see the entire picture and be able to see some of the systematic things that would be able to fix a problem for 100,000 people. Oftentimes when we get to a certain level or we ascend to a certain lifestyle, curriculum, educational practice, our vision becomes a little blurry and narrow as to what we can see and what we can solve. So for me, community has probably been the biggest thing for me. Very rich in tradition and cultural activism here in the nation's capital. So that's probably the biggest one.
In terms of mobilization, I mentioned a couple of things. One is like demystifying advocacy, as DaVaughn started to talk about before, because I think as soon as you step into it and do a little bit of it, you realize that the bar is not as high as you thought it was in many respects. And that, I mean, there are organizations like Empower Ed, but many others in all kinds of activism especially in our city, but many other places that facilitate that process, right? And they really care about people who are not traditionally involved in the advocacy process, learning the ropes of it. But I would say it's that initial impression. Give people a million ways to do something small, and some of those people are going to stick around and do big things, right? So I would say that, like, give people a million ways to get involved, and I think that's a lot of what Carolyn and I like spend our time doing, is just like offer a lot of things, right? And people will get involved in some little thing, and that's a hook for them to get involved more, and that's eventually the base building. And then I would say, just because of the moment we're in, nothing like a crisis. I think the reality is when there's a crisis, there is a deluge of people wanting to take action in a way, but I think it's not always easy to absorb that appetite into meaningful, lasting change. And I think, so in terms of strategy, it really is like, how do we capitalize on energy when the energy naturally exists, and allow that to turn into something that's lasting and not just activism, but organizing.
I think, so Scott was talking a little bit earlier about like giving people a lot of options. So one thing that we do is like pretty much weekly, we send out an email with a whole bunch of actions to our teacher email list that we have painstakingly created. And it has like a ton of actions, and some of them are big, like come to this rally, come to this action, come testify with us. Some of them are a lot smaller. Can you just like fill out this survey for us? Can you just like email back and say, tell us what's going on at your school? How's the year going? But I think also it's pretty much like relational, and that's not surprising. It's, you relationship builds with your students, it builds with kids. And so I think a big part of this for us has been like having community events and like literally like recognizing people's faces, and it like means so much to someone. You can like see them light up if you like, oh, I'm Caroline, what's your name? And then I'm like, oh, I remember you emailed me in September about this thing. And they're like, oh wow, because I think we'll also often think that we're like a much bigger staff and organization than we are. And so sometimes like I think there's this assumption that it's like a robo message, and we're like, no, like I'm literally sitting here texting like hundreds of people, like please come to this action. And so I think people see that there's like actual people behind this, and that like we want to build a relationship with you, like according to your capacity has been.
For me, I think there's been a couple of things. One, and this kind of sounds like it's a given, but like listening to people. So I think the biggest thing that I've noticed is that when people feel heard or part of a process, they're more likely to join in on that process. And people often have solutions to things that you might not have thought about. And so I think finding ways to just ask questions and kind of get stakeholder feedback into solution process is really a good way to kind of draw people in. And in addition to that, having grace with people and being consistent, right? And so knowing that everybody is drawn in a million different directions and being okay with, somebody showing up one day and not the other. And but also like being consistent in the way that you kind of don't take that to heart and kind of consistently reach the people.
And I think some of the strategies we talk about here, when we talk about, parent engagement, right? When we want to engage families, like also, I feel like along those lines could be some like good ideas we could take as teachers to have a higher parental participation in classrooms. My last question for the panel, which you alluded to a little bit, given the current crisis or or not. So what resistance have you participated or observed at DC schools or at the city level as a response to the anti-DEI, anti-immigrant?
Yeah, well, we're doing a lot right now and trying to manage and prioritize all of that. I was saying, Caroline and I talk a lot about outside versus inside game and like how much are we doing direct action versus using the civic system that exists. And one of the things is I think there's good purpose of more subversive kind of outside game efforts. And I think that's important sometimes. And there's also ways in which you're doing things that look traditional, but are very agitating to the system in productive ways. So I'll just share, like we're going to talk about this a little more later, but we've been organizing around this Defend DC coalition, defending public education here against federal threats. We're gathering feedback, listening to people, what's happening in schools, listening in particular to school leaders about how DC public schools was or was not responding to the threats to immigrant students and families, to trans students and staff and other things right now. And it was really alarming. And we felt there's a need to say something to DCPS about the kind of approach, which was like, let's lay low, keep our heads down and hope Trump doesn't come after us kind of. And we felt like we needed to speak out about that approach. And I would say there's tremendous pressure on us not to say anything from them. The mayor's team felt very strongly that, it would be sabotaging their strategy essentially to say anything about it out loud, right? The reality was what they were saying they were doing is just not what people were feeling they were doing, right, on the ground. And so you'll have like experienced that tension a lot. So we ended up putting together a letter and sending that out. How 700 people sign on to it, about 25 organizations that are in DC, and sending that to them. And that is like a act that seems very traditional, but in this case was very agitating of the status quo because they were actively saying like, this is not our strategy. Like we don't want you to take this approach. So there's been a lot of times where we've done things as pushback to some of those efforts that have been holding a rally, been a little more aggressive, mass email campaigns, call-in campaigns, and that kind of thing. But I do think it's worth thinking about that sometimes it's just the actual like creation of the tension with the people who have the power that can be powerful itself, which is like, we're not going to let this coast. There needs to be a change in the dynamic here. And even if it's something that feels more traditional, like the knowledge, and I would say people really respect this. We had, we'll share one more example, a council member who I've been friends with for a long time, personally from before he was on the council, and who's been an ally for us in many other efforts. At the end of last year, we were really in tension about something that we wanted as a budget priority, right? And we pushed back real hard against, the position that he was taking on that versus, what we were hearing from teachers. And I would say in the end, I think one thing to think about as we push back against some of these things that are really urgent right now is people will respect you more if they know you're willing to do that, even if they are people you typically ally with. And so I think this is a moment with all these kind of attacks that some of the people we typically ally with need as much push as at those we don't.
I was in a school this morning with our colleague Gracie, and it was like a listening session for enormous appetite to do something of action. And so I think this is definitely a situation where like it is really helpful for us to create that tension. And also where like the general, you know, population of DC and especially like our educators and our school communities are very much like ahead of the administration, their energy to stand up. And I think that's been difficult to navigate, but it's also been like really reassuring in a way that like, okay, well, we know that the community will come together and we know that the community will help our students and like, you know, stand up for educators. And I think in that sense, another thing that I'm hearing a lot from some of our teachers is like, I feel very lucky actually to be in DC while this is going down. This, you know, like bubble where I know that like the other people in my neighborhood and the other people in the city and in the community are going to fight this fight along with me. I'm not standing in this alone.
I think too, what's really helpful in these kinds of tense spaces is to come with solutions, right? And oftentimes, especially in times of when you know there's an issue going on, I think it's really helpful to make that change happen when you have some proposed solutions. And I think a lot of times we kind of get caught up in, this isn't working for me. Okay, that's not working for you, but at the same point in time, what would work for you? And so kind of being more proactive and kind of solutions oriented is a really good tool to kind of have in your tool belt as well.
The change in administration, I think the biggest resistance I've seen, I'm gonna piggyback off of everybody very quickly, is the tension that we create. Being knowledgeable and aware of what we can do with that inside-outside game. I think there's been a lot of that going on now. And when you create a crisis or you push people into a corner, I think it allows them to create this appetite for change. There was not as much, and this just may be me, and I could be completely wrong. I hope it is no video recording, but no, it's okay. The best concentration that I've seen around DEI and immigrant deportation, I wish we kind of had with the crisis of school shooting. If we could have taken this type of organization or rally with that, I think that we could have solved a few more problems. All of that to say, when you create tension and you operate within the parameters of what you know you can do, that agitation is there and it's like a prick in their side and they're forced to pay attention to it. I also think when you create a crisis, you're talking about teachers that are essentially in a mother or father figure all day, every day for these children, and you are literally threatening to come and snatch them out of their hand. Your child, not gonna work. So I think the best thing that we can do is to create the tension and be agitated, be strategic in the things that we do and we can't do. The third thing. It's also very interesting because sometimes I think the things that we not create, but the things that we face as crises or pivotal moments in history and education where we can change things, it's important to talk about them, and it's important how we shape the younger generation's mind. Because for me at my school, Hispanic or Latino Mexican population is not high, but when my daughter goes to school, it's a thing for her. So it's really a conversational point that I have for her as to, well, what will you do? What do you think should happen? What do you think will change? Because it's something that we may not be able to solve now, but that generation, the 10 to 15-year-olds, when in 10 years, those may be the children that say, I thought of this and I know that we can change this thing this way. So creating attention and agitation, being knowledgeable, and just having an open conversation.
Thank you so much for what you shared. So I'm gonna open the floor for the audience to ask questions. Also we have you find the lady sitting at the back of the classroom. Do you have a question for the panel? Because, yeah. Oh, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm DaVaughn. I'm a potential grad student, so I'm just here. I don't have a question as of right now, but maybe when somebody else asks a question, like,
Okay. I just wanted to give you the opportunity first because they will have more chance to collaborate more deeply with the panelists during the workshops. So if you don't have a question, so the rest of us, do we have, anybody has a question? There's only time for one.
We got one right here.
I was gonna ask Dominique this directly, but since it's one, I'd like to hear from all of you. But I work for DCPS, so I'm particularly interested in that perspective. But where in your teaching role, where have you found spaces to meaningfully and successfully collaborate with policymakers? And what does the format of those spaces look like? And basically, like, in what formats do you feel like you've been heard by policymakers or district leaders?
I think I've gained probably the most knowledge and structure joining Empower Ed, and that structure is honestly what we're gonna go through a little later with the organizing guide. Is like taking a problem and figuring out tangible solutions and not just being able to go and complain. However, the steps that I feel like I take, well, all of our council members, policymakers, lobbyists, they're all government officials. And you'll just be surprised what honestly a quick email or a phone call can honestly do to get your foot in the door, or for your email to be heard, or to get a meeting on the books or anything like that. But definitely looking at that organizing structure and climbing the chain. I honestly, I'm a bad person to talk to. I be getting in trouble all the
But you've
time.
accomplished a lot with your advocacy. I mean,
I do.
she's been leading advocacy for community schools, which last year the mayor completely cut in the budget, eliminated the program. And, you know, Dominique and other teachers had laid the groundwork for us to fight back against that. And after that cut happened, we formed a coalition, held a mass rally, did a walk around at the council, interrupted the chairman's press conference, you know, did some really quick, yeah, exactly, and did some quick action. And within about a week, we turned that around and the council put the funding back in the budget. So I would just say that, like, you know, yeah, us
Thanks, guys.
big way. We've had a lot of wins. So, I mean, I think, you know, just like in the 6-7 years that we've been, you know, doing this model, I'd say there hasn't been a year where we haven't had a significant win, including in years in the budget where they've said there are no new programs going into this budget. We don't have money right now. And, you know, last year, that was very much the message we got from everybody. And we were like, yeah, but there's 2 or 3 things we need you to do in the budget here. And we got at least pieces of most of the things we asked for, including, you know, money for some schools to add permanent substitutes. Teacher created an idea that we should have money set aside for schools that don't have big PTOs and fundraising for field trips. We said we need $300,000 set aside for that, and we got $300,000 in the budget for that. So, you know, I think you create a situation where the price to be paid for not responding to us, right, is bigger than the price tag of what we're asking for. And it is like the grassroots pressure of them feeling like they know we're going to show up on their door if that doesn't happen, and they know what we're going to say to the public if they don't do the thing we're asking them to do. They know the narrative we're creating about them and the choice that we're putting before them, and it's that pressure.
Yeah, I definitely think identifying those key players in your problem, your school board representative, your council member, your instructional superintendent, and basically shaking the table. If you go to them with a problem, but hey, and I have a solution, it's tangible. Like I said, DC is very historic. Everybody watch House of Cards? Everybody saying House of Cards? I don't know why House of Cards just keeps coming into my brain, but I mean, very much like that. Once you learn the structure and how to attack a problem, and you have a tangible solution, and you can take people data and you can take people research, they're willing to listen. Because the thing is, somebody put them in that seat because they just sold a good game, not because they have all the answers. And I think the more experts that we continue to push into their faces, the more they're forced to listen. Because the last thing they want to do is be on the wrong side of something. So if you make enough noise, they'll listen. And whatever your problem is, we can talk about it. I don't.
But I brought you in here, so they can have connections with you and go to you with their problem. All right, so, would you complain if I say we get a 5-minute break? No. Keep it to yourself if you do. What do you think, Anne?
That's really.
Not the kids, but